Hello, welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the old box office. It is a nerdy podcast. I walk through how well movies do, what their per theater average is, talk about some light statistics, maybe a little algebra. No calculus. This is the non-calculus podcast. In any event, today's show is going to be a preview show. I do two types of shows. I do preview shows usually in the middle of the week or Thursday to walk through what's coming out this weekend at the box office. And then I usually do a review show on Sunday once the Sunday estimates come out around Sunday afternoon. Today's show is going to be a preview. We're going to talk about what's coming up this weekend. It's kind of a special show. It's Justice League, right? Justice League is this big moment at the box office. It's a big moment for comic book films, for DCEU. It's just a big moment in movies in general, to be honest with you. Ever since Avengers came out in 2012 and really changed the ball game for blockbuster tentpole films, I think people have been wondering, been worried, been excited about where DC was going to take their ensemble film Justice League. And we got a little bit of a preview with Zack Snyder's work in the DCEU with Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, and then, of course, sort of the side ensemble film, the DCEU, Suicide Squad. So we have sort of an idea of what is leading up to this really big moment at the box office, and for I think it's the defining moment of DC and their film universe that they have created. Now, obviously, the shadow of Marvel looms over all of this, and I say that because Marvel has completely changed the entertainment industry, not just the movie industry, but the entire sort of entertainment industry worldwide. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, which technically started with Iron Man in 2008, has been going for the last decade and really has rewritten the rules across the board. It has been so unbelievably successful at creating not only huge tentpole blockbuster movies that, basically take in profits. We're talking $200 million often is the case in terms of their success. Massive wins from these films, and also this whole TV universe as well, in streaming universe. On top of that, it's really crazy how well they've done. It's basically unimaginable. If you told anybody in 2008, here's what Marvel and Disney Buena Vista is planning to do, they would say, yeah, that might work, or if it does work, it'll be sort of like a nice little cool thing that's happening in the entertainment industry. They would not say that it basically ripped out the foundation of the entertainment industry and rebuilt it, which is essentially what happened. And that sounds maybe like hyperbole, but it's not. Like, Marvel has really changed our entire concept of a movie studio, changed our concept of how films work and interrelate together. So I think that DC has this huge shadow on top of them. And I think, unfortunately, when we look back at some of the movies they've put out over the last few years, that shadow has really hurt them in a way. It's almost sort of like when you think about somebody who always comes in second, right? Someone who wants that spotlight, who wants to be number one, but for whatever reason is always trying to play to the strengths of the best, which would be Marvel in this case, right? DC has that sort of chip on their shoulder. They want to be the best. They want to create something like Marvel, but they always end up sort of doing a copy of Marvel, or just trying too hard to be serious, to create these very poignant films. And I think Batman vs. Superman is the perfect example of this, where it was so overcooked. It's like they tried to do what Marvel did, but they didn't really understand what made Marvel's movies so successful. And this has sort of been the case since the start of the DCEU with Man of Steel, which, didn't do poorly, right? It did okay. But I think critically it struggled. And that sort of set the whole universe kind of off on the wrong foot, so to speak. Man of Steel, I think it ended up in the 50s on Rotten Tomato, I want to say. Directed by Zack Snyder. Everybody was very excited for it, right? It was the return of Superman, and it came across as very sort of sterile. It ended up opening at $116 million. This would have been June of 2013. So the universe is really not that old. It's just started up in the last 4 years. It was PG-13, so you're sort of your typical superhero. Although I don't know how it was PG-13 because it was a very sort of violent film. Production budget was well over $200 million, $225 million bucks. It was incredibly long, 2 hours and 23 minutes. It was the kickoff, and it did not go that well. It ended up at $291 million in the United States and Canada. The foreign take was 377. So the total for Man of Steel was $668 million. Right. And so, keep in mind, it's coming 5 years after Iron Man. And Iron Man was, of course, the start of the MCU officially. Right. So they're about 5 years after Marvel. They're bringing Zack Snyder, who is sort of like, at this moment in his career, was acclaimed. But was not perfect. He certainly had a strong visual style to his work. Sucker Punch was the movie before this, only made $36 million total. He did Legends of the Guardians. I'm just looking at his little filmography now. What? Come on, dude. Did $55 million bucks. He did Watchtower. Watchmen. I think Watchmen was really his calling card into DC. Right. Obviously, he did 300. That was his really, really big film, his most successful film up until Man of Steel. It did $210 million domestically. And that's where he established his style. He got his career started with Dawn of the Dead, which I think is probably, and this is just me speaking personally, my favorite Zack Snyder film by far. Dawn of the Dead is the original, the George Romero absolute masterpiece of horror and social commentary. Is in my top 3 films all time. And so I was a really tough person to win over with that film. And I think Zack Snyder didn't really take that much from the original, to be honest with you, but he did so much interesting stuff with the zombie subgenre that I just really enjoyed it. It was a really fun film. And it was very exciting and fast paced, right? Was it written well? Not really. Did he get the, did he pick up any of the finer points of the, consumerist critique of George Romero? Absolutely not. But it was a very fun film, and I think, honestly, shouldn't have been called Dawn of the Dead. Could have been called something completely different, and it would have been fine. But I think it was a big win for him and got his career sort of started out on the right track. And this is only 2004, right? So we're talking 13 years ago. It kind of, on the one hand, seems super long ago. It's 13 years ago, but you're thinking about the style of the film, and it felt very ahead of its time, to be honest with you. So then does 300 3 years later, probably his most well-known film. Definitely established the Zack Snyder style, right? Those action shots, the slow-mo, almost like the scenes were moving paintings. I mean, they were beautiful, beautiful imagery. But again, in the same way that Dawn of the Dead felt really light in the writing department, missed a lot of emotional cues, kind of skimmed along the surface on sort of the emotion and characterization. Legend of the Owls, Legend of the Guardians, I can't really talk to. I've never seen. Sucker Punch is the same. All I know is my favorite critics, when they talk about Sucker Punch, they ravage that film. Style over substance, right? I think that's always been the critique of Zack Snyder, style over substance. And I can't necessarily disagree with that. As much as I enjoyed Dawn of the Dead and I enjoyed 300, I hated Watchmen. And it's one of my favorite graphic novels. It's one of my favorite pieces of literature. I thought it's hard to put into words. He certainly made it look like the graphic novel, but he missed everything about it. He missed all the subtext of that beautiful piece of literature. And I call it literature because, you know, I can do that. I have my master's in literature, so I think I have the right to deem something literature. It's up there with some of the most beautiful novels I've ever read in my life. It's up there to me with Faulkner. I think Alan Moore is an absolute brilliant genius thinker and wonderful writer. And I think Watchmen, to me, is definitely one of the greatest pieces of literature of the last 50 years. And I think Zack Snyder felt that too. But when he created the movie, he just really missed a ton of the... It's like if Watchmen is 100 miles deep, he got about 20 miles deep. And he did really well in that 20 miles, but he missed the last 80 miles of that book and the subtext to it. And I think that's where a lot of that style of or substance sort of critique started to come to a head. And I think when we get to Man of Steel and the start of DC, and this is what it's all about, you know, we're talking about Justice League, we're talking about how did this come to be and where are we now in this world? You know, Man of Steel is one of those movies where personally, as someone who is not a massive fan of comic book movies, but I do give them the time of day. I critique a comic book movie like I would critique any film, whether it's an art film, whether it's a rated R bro-y comedy. I critique them kind of all the same. That's sort of what my background is in. And I found Man of Steel to be kind of a mess. Very dark, and I'm not really sure why. And I think maybe that was... people have been saying it's the anti-Marvel. Like if you look at the first Iron Man, pretty playful movie. And I guess the rest of the Iron Man movies are pretty playful as well. Man of Steel is dour, it's stolen, it's sad, it's tragic. It has this sort of weighty sadness to it that doesn't necessarily match how Superman is viewed in pop culture, right? And so it was a play that he did. He did a sort of different take on it, and I don't think it worked all that well, to be honest with you. But it did okay at the box office, right? It opened at 116. This is after Avengers, right? So Avengers the year before broke that $200 million barrier, really changed the ballgame. And I'm going to say this, you're going to hear me repeat myself 1,000 times. Marvel changed everything. We just need to get that into our head. They changed everything. And DC is trying to do something similar, but as we're going to see, and I think the same is going to go for Justice League, it's just not all there right now. And Man of Steel was sort of the perfect example of that. Huge production budget. Warner Brothers put out all the stops for it, gave Zack Snyder everything he needed and wanted for that film, and it just ended up coming short. Right? It was not a fun watch. That brings us to, Batman versus Superman, and this is only, I do believe Zack Snyder wanted to do Man of Steel 2 first. That's the rumor that I hear. I think that probably would have been a good move. I think Man of Steel needed another movie. Maybe he brings in a different director of cinematography or photography, maybe a different editor, definitely a different story or a script writer or a few of them to help him flesh out the emotional draw of that film. But I think that would have been a better path for DC, is to make another Man of Steel, get their sea legs a little bit with making these films, creating that foundation of a good cinematic universe like Marvel did, and then work your way into something like Justice League. But I think the executives at Warner Brothers wanted to catch up quickly, right? They saw the dollar signs that Marvel was bringing in. They're like, we have this amazing catalog of content that is similar to Marvel. DC Comics, been around forever. They have all the big names like Batman and Superman, Wonder Woman, right? Like, why can't we make what Marvel is doing? And this is going to be the reoccurring theme of them sort of copying and mimicking or trying to what Marvel is doing, But I think what we're going to find is, and this is actually a big business lesson. And I have my background obviously in art criticism, like I've talked a lot on this podcast. But most of my sort of adult life now has been in startups and creating businesses. And I've worked with very small businesses. I've worked with businesses with revenues in the billions. One of the key things that I've always noticed, in terms of starting a business or thinking about your competitors in business, and Amazon has this as I think one of their mottos, they never think about the competition, right? You're trying to do something unique, create a unique value proposition, and that is your end goal, and that should be the only thing you're thinking about. You shouldn't be looking over your shoulder. Right? That's one of the key, almost fatal flaws of business, is looking over your shoulder at your competition too much. And I feel like that's what's happened with DC for the most part. Now, part of me is speaking from kind of the art critic aspect of things. I think the DC movies have been almost all of them abject failures on an artistic level. And I don't mean to be harsh about that, but if I'm going to be fair, a fair critic of them, I have a bias against comic book movies in general. I don't enjoy a lot of them. My favorite one probably the last few years, I loved Deadpool and I loved Logan. I thought they were both fantastic, really, really well done films. So that gives you kind of where my bias is. I like those kind of the fourth wave comic book movies. I actually like a lot. Wonder Woman, I really enjoyed as well. Didn't think it was fantastic. Thought it was really good. Easily the best DC film of this new DCEU, right? So, we have Man of Steel, kind of a whimper a little bit, not a huge bang, but I don't think it was a flop. I don't think you could argue it was a flop. It made over $600 million worldwide. Warner Brothers wanted to do more with a $225 million production budget. You would expect it to do just a little bit more than that, but it did make a large profit. Batman versus Superman also made a sizable profit, but I think extremely underperformed to expectations, right? I think they found a way on the back end to arrange things so it made, God, I don't even know what it made profit-wise. I think $100 million in profit. I think just about $100 million in profit. I'll have to check that on Deadline. But the main problem with Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice, I've seen this movie multiple times. It is an incoherent creative mess. It makes literally almost zero sense when you watch it. I was in awe when watching it of how much a complete and utter mess it was compared to something like some of the better Marvel films. And there's no other way to sort of talk about this stuff than constantly comparing it to Marvel, because that's what DC did. They're building this universe in response to Marvel's universe. So Batman versus Superman, in terms of, and I'm just walking through the history of DC until we get up to Justice League, because I think it's really important to talk about the context of these films and how business-wise Justice League fits into this big puzzle, right? And so Batman vs. Superman opens at 166, which is good, right? There's no way you can argue that that's bad. Opens at this is March of 2016. So we're talking about a year and a half ago. Opens at 166, has a catastrophic multiplier. I believe it's sub 2x. And this is sort of Zack Snyder's unfortunate calling card. The sub 2x multiplier is, there's no other way to put it than a complete and utter disaster, right? And so I already said the movie made money, right? It did make money. It made over $100 million in profit. So Warner Brothers on that level was happy. But we're talking Batman versus Superman. We're talking two of the biggest characters in the history of comics and the history of entertainment, right? Over the last 50, 60 years. Like, these are icons, cultural icons, and you have them in a movie together. It opens at 166, ends at 130 domestically, sub 2x multiplier. And what that suggests, and what happened, and I got to pull up the Rotten Tomatoes score here real quick. And I remember following this movie the weekend of, because it was like the biggest thing ever. People were like, how is this going to beat Avengers? That was the big sort of, the big line that was going on. Is this going to beat Avengers? This is going to hit $200 million. It didn't. I think the tracking was at like 180. It obviously didn't hit that, right? But it was above 150. So it wasn't a total flop on opening weekend. But even within opening weekend, it popped off on Thursday and Friday. The previews were out of this world. But by Saturday and Sunday, you notice this pretty significant drop off. Like it was a cliff in the ocean, just dropped right off into a trench. And that's where you got that sub 2x multiplier, because that trench just kept going and going and going. You know, it did not really recover from its basically collapse on opening weekend, the later half of the opening weekend. And we can see why, right? 27% score on Rotten Tomatoes, 23% from top critics. And that's from 372 reviews. So it's not a small sample number of reviews. Basically loathed, absolutely loathed by reviewers. And rightly so. I think it was a complete and utter mess. Audience score 63% sitting there right now. I thought it would be lower than that. I thought it would probably be in the 50s or 40s, but I'm not sure where it was when it opened. So here you have Man of Steel, which I think was, I love my baseball metaphors, in terms of, you know, what did it do? Probably about a double, right? Definitely not triple, not a strikeout, but probably a standing double, pretty comfortable double. Batman versus Superman, if you looked at financials, you'd say, oh, it might even be a home run, right? But when you look at the context of the film and you look at who was involved and you look at the amount riding on that film in terms of building out the universe, it feels like a strikeout to me. It just feels creatively, it's an absolute strikeout. It really, really hurt the DC brand. And we may see that the repercussions of that here this weekend when Justice League opens. And I know I'm going on for a very long time about DC, but I feel like to me, it is so fascinating to talk about how DC has managed this extended cinematic universe, how it compares to Marvel, and what does that say about Justice League and how it's going to do this weekend? Because without the context, we're not really going to figure out what it's going to do. So then Batman vs Superman, right? So like, tough, really tough. But later that year, you have Suicide Squad. And remember that the original trailer for Suicide Squad was kind of a mess. But basically in response to Deadpool doing so well in February, they recut the trailer and I believe re-edited the movie to make it more in line with the lighter music heavy tone of Deadpool, right? And I think that was a very, very good choice. I think they salvaged what could have been another Batman versus Superman creative disaster. Now I say that Suicide Squad opened in August 2016, right? So only a few months after Batman vs Superman. Big film. Rotten Tomato score 26%. So according to critics, same exact terrible flaming car wreck that was Batman vs Superman. I've seen Suicide Squad. I agree 100%. I think Batman vs Superman, I think, is significantly worse than Suicide Squad. To me, like, if just to throw this out there, if I had to give it I like to do a 100% scale out of 100%, I would give Batman vs Superman low 40s. I would give Suicide Squad probably high 50s, right? So to me, neither of them are very great films. Suicide Squad almost mimics here. So 26% Rotten Tomato score from critics. Top critics gave it 20%. Audience score 61%. So very in line with Batman and Superman, almost identical. Financially, it does decently well. I think the expectation for Suicide Squad wasn't really that high, but it opened in the 130s, right? And that, I think, was a surprise to a lot of people, especially because August tends to be a little bit quieter part of the summer. I think for a long time, people overemphasized how important August was, but it was more about July and June and May, and has been for the last 20 years. August is sort of tacked on there as part of the summer, but it can be really quiet. This summer is a perfect example of that. I mean, this August, it's absolute crickets. I think the box office lost $500 million in August this year because it was a little too quiet. So Suicide Squad kind of overrides that August quietness. There's 133 opening weekend. And this is only a year and some ago, right? Lifetime gross is $325 million for Suicide Squad, so it does well domestically. Worldwide does 745, so better than Man of Steel, right? So a very good performance. Just to throw this out there, Batman vs Superman did 873 worldwide, so that's the best worldwide performance of DC up to this point, right? So this finds DC in a really interesting place, right? So financially, they're doing okay, right? Suicide Squad made a big profit. Batman vs Superman, big profit. Man of Steel, I think, did decent in terms of profit, right? They're all, I think, in the top 15 or top 20 most profitable films of the year. So when you're looking at it on that side of things, Warner Brothers is doing well. DC Films is doing well. DCEU is off to a decent start, right? That's if you look at just the financials. If you look at it from a creative sort of cultural level, there is a massive quality problem inside DCEU. And it is apparent to everybody who's watched these films who is not sort of jaded by fanboyism or sort of just being a supporter of DC and not really caring about those flaws, that Zack Snyder lies at the center of those problems. Now, of course, he didn't do Suicide Squad, right? But Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman, did sort of influence the look and feel of Suicide Squad. It's part of DCEU, and they gave that over to Zack Snyder. So there's a quality problem, right? And so coming into this year, I think there was some major concerns about Justice League opening in November. And I think there is Wonder Woman this summer. The feeling going into Wonder Woman was that okay, this is kind of a one-off thing. This is a little bit new. It's the first real big female driven superhero film since Catwoman, which was one of the worst disasters of the last decade. The basketball scene alone is a meme at how terrible it was. So they're going to try it again. And they're going to try out Wonder Woman. So I don't think the stakes were really that high for Wonder Woman. I think they were culturally just from maybe more feminists thinking this has to do well. We want it to do well. And so they were really jazzed about it. But I think that the general population was sort of oh, if it's good, I'll go see it. And it was good. And the general population really enjoyed it. And it really, I think, Wonder Woman came along at a time that was just sort of perfect for it, for our culture. We're going through this, maybe an awakening to gender equality that maybe has been dormant for a long time. I remember our culture going through this in the 90s. They used to call it was PC culture back then, right? That was the big thing. And we're going through something like that again. And this is when sort of women feel empowered to speak out about the oppression they feel in our society. Right, and I think a lot of that stems from the politics that are happening right now, and unfortunately, it's become kind of a shit-flinging fight over the last few years, especially with the political campaign that happens. I could do a political podcast. I'm just as a political junkie as I'm a box office junkie, and a lot of it stems from that race between Hillary and Trump, and that conflict between this seemingly strong woman and this very sort of obnoxious, piggish, chauvinist male. And so that's permeated out into culture in general, and Wonder Woman was a part of that sort of back and forth. But none of that really mattered because the movie was really great, right? Especially I loved the first hour of this film. God, the first hour was so good. The last hour to me was not great, but whatever. I enjoyed the first hour enough. 92% Rotten Tomatoes. This came out in June this year, early June. 92% Rotten Tomatoes from critics, 92% from top critics. 50 reviews, only 4 were rotten from the top critics. Audience score just below 90%. Bye quality problems, right? Patty Jenkins really changed the path of DC. She really did. And that's why they brought her on for the second one. Wonder Woman 2 got the green light. I think it's coming out in November of 2019. So 2 years from now. So Man of Steel, not a great film, not a terrible film. Made some money. Batman vs Superman, critical failure, absolute complete mess. made a decent amount of cash though. Suicide Squad, same exact story. Made a decent amount of cash. Quality wise, a complete and utter debacle. So coming into this year, it did not look great for DCEU. I think people were super nervous because Zack Snyder was not taken off of Justice League. Justice League had already started sort of pre-production when Batman vs Superman was released. That's what I've heard, at least. I don't know if that was just like bullshit rumors, but that's what I heard. So it would have been kind of an issue if they took Zack Snyder off that early, right? In hindsight, we'll get to it. I'm not going to talk about Justice League yet. So Wonder Woman sort of changes the vibe and feel of DC. It's no longer sort of semi-successful movie series. Wonder Woman opens at 103, closes out over $400 million. Basically a 4x multiplier. Compare that to Batman vs Superman sub 2x, right? So completely different story. Wonder Woman is beloved. I think everybody who saw it, for the most part, really enjoyed it. And you see that in the numbers and how it played over the summer. Just did not stop making money. It opened a little bit lower than I thought it should have. Tracking was it was at 65 for Wonder Woman. I think people forget that going into that weekend. But it just kept overperforming that tracking as it got closer to release. And then it sort of blew up. And like that 103 was a little bit depressed because people didn't really know. I think they were a little worried about the DC quality problems. Should I go see this? Once those first audience reactions came in, it was like, okay, I gotta go see this. This looks awesome. So that gives us the context here. So DC had some major quality problems going into Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman sort of changed the game, but again, it was Patty Jenkins, different director. It had a very, very different feel to it than the other films. It was a lot lighter, especially that first half hour, 40 minutes, was a lot lighter. The main character was not cynical, was not depressed, was sort of a very curious and open and wanted to help. A very warm presence, right? And so it just had a completely different tone to the rest of the movie. So then that brings us to Justice League, which is opening this weekend. That's what this whole show is about. How is this going to play? Now, I don't have a Rotten Tomato score for you right now. The Rotten Tomato score is going to drop in about 2.5 hours. It'll drop midnight Eastern time, 11 o'clock Central here. I'm in Nashville. I'm on Central time. So we don't really know where it's going to go from that, the actual Rotten Tomato score. But I can tell you right now that the review embargo was dropped last night, actually it was this morning, like 4 a.m. or something like that. So Metacritic is up. Metacritic has compiled these reviews, the ones that are up so far. And so we have an idea of where this score is going to go, Rotten Tomatoes. I don't want to act like Rotten Tomatoes is the end all be all, but it kind of is right now. I mean, it's the best way to sort of get a quick viewpoint of how this film's going to do. On Metacritic, it sits at 49, which is terrible. A very, very, very bad score, especially for a movie this big, with this big of a budget, with this much writing on it. The score is not good. And I can't help but think that, leading into Justice League, we had these massive quality problems before Wonder Woman. And it seems like those quality problems are now bleeding into Justice League. Zack Snyder started out as director on this movie, shot most of it, shot the first 85%, I think, had to drop out. There's a tragedy in his family and decided, hey, I need to pass this film on to somebody else so they can focus on it. That got passed off to Josh Whedon, who I believe wrote the script, or at least was part writer of the script. I know, who is a wonderful director. I think Josh Whedon is a hero to a lot of us. I think he's a wonderful, wonderful guy who's so accomplished. I came across him first with Buffy was one of my favorite shows growing up, and I sort of have a ton of respect for Josh Whedon. And obviously he's a comic book guy. He understands how this stuff works. So he came in to sort of, recut the film, re-edit the film. He reshot, I think, about 15% of it. And it's sort of a mixture of his final product and Zack Snyder's final product. So right there, it has a little bit of a troubled history, production-wise. So you're going to expect it to be a little bit uneven, right? Zack Snyder and Josh Whedon have very different styles. Josh Whedon is much more cerebral, much more verbally based. And there's a lot more going on with his characters than I think Zack Snyder, who is more visually based, more action based. So there's going to be some conflict there with the style of this film. And I think that, like, going into it, I think a lot of people sort of understand that. Like, we're not going to hold it against the film necessarily that Zack Snyder had to drop out because of a family thing. Like, it's just, like, stupid. Like, you're going to give it some benefit of the doubt. And I think critics do on some level. The problem here is that, and I've read through a lot of these reviews today, and there's some reviewers that I respect a lot. Anybody associated with the BBC, I tend to respect their opinion significantly more than most. Mick LaSalle at the San Francisco Chronicle is probably my favorite reviewer. They have both, and Robbie Collins, I believe, is the guy who did it for the BBC. He's also, but he wrote it for the Telegraph, but he also does some guest spots in the BBC 5 for their movie reviews. They basically eviscerated the film. And most of the British reviews, the Guardian one is also pretty vicious. The British reviewers in general, and this is, why I like them a little bit more, they don't really put on blinders, right? And like, they sort of, they see it for what it is. They tend to not give a shit about allegiances to any sort of brand or company. And so they're kind of, maybe a little bit too honest and too blunt with their opinions. But that's sort of what I like. And they were not happy with this film. And so what I think we're seeing is, unfortunately, the quality problems that were so prevalent, were prevalent in Man of Steel, but just so blatantly obvious in Batman vs Superman. I mean, just an absolute mess of a film. Have bled over into Justice League. And so we got to sort of take that into account when we're looking at what it's going to do this weekend. And I haven't even talked about track. I mean, I could talk, man, it's so funny. Like, I clearly state that, like, I'm not this super lover of comic book movies just in general, right? But I honestly could talk about this stuff for just hours. I'm already at like nearly like 40 minutes now, and I haven't really talked about what we think Justice League is going to do. And I don't give a fuck, because I'm having a good time with this. I could talk about this shit forever. So there's quality problems with Justice League, I think, is the point I'm trying to make. And of course, like, Metacritic is like fucking up right now. I don't know what's going on. Is it like the website down? It's like, are the DC fans attacking the website because they're pissed at the reviews? It's possible. But I was going to read some of the reviews and sort of the point, but I've read enough to sort of give you an idea of what their criticisms are. And I think that very similar criticisms to what Batman versus Superman faced. A very messy narrative, not really clear what's happening and why. The plot seems to sort of jump along almost at random. Glaring plot holes. There's a great, Robert Collins has a great metaphor in his Telegraph review. I think I have to paraphrase it because I can't pull it up, but essentially the plot holes are so big in Justice League that they're as big as the Grand Canyon, and you kind of want to just stick around and see how they play out, like you watch a sunset of the Grand Canyon, something like that. I'm paraphrasing, of course, not as poetic as he is. But you have massive plot holes. I think the standout figure of the film is Flash. I believe that is played by Ezra Miller, if I'm correct. I have to look it up real quick. He's a great actor. He's been in a lot of stuff. He had a really funny part in Trainwreck, actually, the Amy Schumer movie. You might recognize him from that. But he's the standout. I read most of these reviews, and I've probably read about 30 reviews of this movie, and he's noted as a standout in basically all of them. So you can guarantee that Ezra Miller did a really good job in this film and really comes out looking great. Ben Affleck as Batman is heavily criticized. I think people say Henry Cavill, this is his best version of Superman. So that's a good sign. I think Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman is also coming out pretty good in this. But Ezra Miller's definitely the standout. Ray Fisher as Cyborg is also sort of noted in some as doing pretty well. And this is not to say that they're good or bad actors or anything like that. It's just sort of like creatively or creative wise, those are the ones that sort of stuck out. Ben Affleck as being sort of completely uneven Batman, totally unconvincing. And I totally agree with that point. Like, I like Ben Affleck as an actor. I like him. He's a pretty decent director as well. He does not play Batman well for me. He's too quiet. He's too demure. He just doesn't, he's unconvincing. And there's a great analogy. He's unconvincing in the suit of Batman. He's also unconvincing in the 3-piece suit, is what one of the reviewers said. And I think that's spot on. He just does not fill out that Batman aura like I think Christian Bale did. I think Christian Bale was just phenomenal as Batman. And I also think George Clooney was a decent Batman. I mean, looking back on it, you know, if you want to rank the Batmans, I think Christian Bale's number 1, Val Kilmer's number 2, George Clooney, and then Michael Keaton. I think Michael Keaton's bad. He just didn't really fill it out really well. So we get a little sidetracked here. Reviewers basically say huge plot holes, plotting along, too serious. It all just reminds me of Batman versus Superman, these criticisms. It sounds like they're talking about Batman versus Superman. So there's a criticism here of essentially Zack Snyder's movie that he made, and it just doesn't work, I think, for a lot of people. And we'll see what the Rotten Tomato score does later on. But that brings us to, what is this movie going to do? Okay, so we have some numbers to look at in terms of DC, right? Man of Steel opens at 116, right? So we're assuming Justice League has all these amazing characters. It should be able to get to 116. Batman vs Superman opens at 166. Great opening, falls apart after that because of quality problems. I think going into this sort of fall season 2-3 months ago, I think 166 felt like it was in play. That is no longer the case. We're in sort of meltdown mode now with this film. The tracking has completely collapsed. Tracking starts officially 3 weeks out from release. We started talking about this film 3 weeks ago at 120s. That scared a lot of people because it was so low. It's now down even farther into the 100, single 100 digits. So, you know, it's more kind of in line with what Wonder Woman did over the summer. Do I believe in this tracking? I have some problems with it, right? I feel like if you're tracking Justice League, which has Wonder Woman, Batman, Superman, Cyborg, Flash, you know, all of these really interesting, fun characters. Aquaman, I forgot about him. He's got his own movie coming out next year. It just seems way too low to me. Like, to me, just based on my gut and what I've been seeing and looking at other movies, you know, I look at this stuff every week. I have a decent idea of how films do. I would expect it to do in the one right now, based on everything I've seen, even with the quality issues. I would say 130s. 130s for the weekend. You know, I don't see it going below Thor in the 120s. Or Spider-Man Homecoming, like 130, whatever that was, 117. I don't see it doing Wonder Woman, like 103. Like, it just doesn't seem plausible that that's going to happen. But tracking suggests otherwise. Tracking suggests that this would be lucky to do 115. And if you look a year ago, 2 years ago, and put that into context, this is an absolute disaster for DCEU. I mean, it's a total unmitigated disaster. The production budget on this movie is one of the most expensive movies ever made. Rumors are it's at least $300 million. And just to put that in perspective for you. So if a movie like this costs $300 million, total costs are at least 3x that production cost. And this is releasing the film worldwide on every single platform you can think of: digital, VOD, TV licensing, streaming, Netflix. The revenue from that's going to be about 3x the production budget. Now, it might be a little bit inflated because of reshoots and stuff like that, so it might be a little out of whack. So you know what? I'm going to give her the benefit of that. I'm going to say total costs are going to be 2.85x the production costs total. So you're looking at about $850 million cost to put this out. So in order to break even, it needs to do about, let's see, 855. It's only going to make about, let's see, 85 to 87% of its total worldwide box office as total revenue. Again, all platforms, all regions, VOD, digital, Redbox, Netflix, you name it. It's going to make 85 to 87% of that revenue will be of the worldwide box office, right? So in order to break even, it needs to do $1 billion, right? So it's in a really, really tough position. None of these movies that we're talking about, DCEU, have broken $1 billion. None of them. Batman vs Superman came, close, but didn't even break 900 million. I don't know what Wonder Woman did worldwide, but I have to see real quick because I don't want to speak out of turn. Did $821 million worldwide, kind of similar to Batman vs Superman. So right now they're in a situation where it has to outperform every other DC film, right? And going into this, a year ago, you would expect it's Justice League. It's all these amazing characters together. Of course it will. But now we have two pieces of data that we can look at. We can look at these reviews, which are some of them, especially from the more professional, more established critics, are vicious. They're almost mean how negative they are. You get the sense that these critics have sat through all of these comic movies after the last 15 years, and they've kind of had it. Justice League is sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. Like, they're just like, I'm not dealing with this anymore. It's trash, right? That's their response. We have that data point. Then you also have the data point of tracking, which is suggesting $100 to $120 million. Let's just call it $110 million opening. Way, way, way below Batman vs Superman. So we're already in a situation here where Justice League, has to sort of pull a Hail Mary not to be a really massive failure. The quality is suspect. We'll see what Rotten Tomatoes says in about 2 hours when it drops the Rotten Tomatoes score. I guarantee you it's not going to be fresh. It's going to be below 70. That's going to hurt general audiences. That's going to hurt the legs massively, like it did with Batman vs Superman. You kind of have to hope that maybe Wonder Woman in it really helps. Maybe Flash, maybe Aquaman really pull this out of the gutter and prevents it from losing a lot of cash. Now, of course, you might say the numbers are off, but like Deadline says this, that. Maybe it doesn't need to make $1 billion to break even. Maybe it needs to make $900 million. That's still a huge stretch right now, right? Like, I don't see how this movie is going to be a financial success. Even if it ends up somehow breaking even and making a little bit of profit, I don't see it doing $200 million profit, which was the expectation for this film, right? That's what a Marvel big movie does. It makes $200 million in profit. This isn't going to come anywhere near it, unless it breaks out somehow, which I don't think it's going to, based on these reviews that are coming in. So, if I had to take a guess of what it's going to do now I'm saying 130s. That's what my gut is saying. But as I say that, it comes out of my mouth, I don't know. It's only on 4,040 screens, which is a smaller open than a massive, massive super wide opening. I would expected this one to be on at least 4,200 screens. So it's already going to be depressed a little bit by that lower number of screens. It's not a ton, but it will make a difference, right? Let's throw some numbers out there, right? So if it does the same per theater average as, say, Wonder Woman, you're looking at, which did about $25,000 per theater. You're looking at just over $100,000 or $100 million. That seems incredibly low to me. I think way, way, way too low. I think it's probably going to go higher than that. Man of Steel, the per theater average on that one was not great. It opened on over 4,200 screens. let's look at Batman versus Superman. I'm already like, I feel negative about this film. I have nothing writing on it, you know? Um, I hope that, I kind of hope that it does okay. I hope that it doesn't just flop. And I don't even know why I hope that. I just feel bad for all these people that are so obsessed with it and really love it. Batman vs. Superman did about $39,000 per theater. If it somehow, some magical way does that well, you're looking at, to be precise, 157. So I'd say that's the absolute max this movie can make is 157. Absolute minimum is 100, right? So that's a big range. My guess is that it does better than Wonder Woman in terms of per theater average, but not by a ton. And I kind of have to figure out where I want to put this in terms of its per theater average, because that's going to drive the exact sort of guess that I want to make for how it's going to do. Now, let's say, you know, in terms of failure and success, I would say anything over 130, I think most people will, especially at Warner Brothers, kind of breathe a sigh of relief, right? They're going to be like, okay, we didn't like flop. We didn't hit the 150, 160 range like we had hoped. And we certainly didn't hit the 180, 200 that we thought we were going to get maybe 3 or 4 years ago. This is all before Batman vs. Superman and Man of Steel and those sort of not great movies. But I think they would be okay doing above 130. Below 130, I think it gets a little bit more dicey. I think anything below 120 is kind of disaster. Below 110, you're talking epic failure. I don't think it could possibly go below 100. I don't think that's mathematically possible. Let's say it does something similar to Thor. You know, everybody thought Thor Justice League was going to beat Thor no matter what. About $30,000 per theater. That would put Justice League at about 121. That feels like a really good guess to me. It really does. And I think the 120s just, to me, feels like it's totally doable. You know, Suicide Squad was 31.5 essentially. So let's see what it does there. I'm just trying to work my way up to $130 million to feel better about myself. 127, if it does the same per theater average as Suicide Squad. I feel it can go higher. Let's look at like something similar to, probably not The Dark Knight. Let's look at Guardians of the Galaxy 2, which did $33,700 per theater. If somehow Justice League pulls that off, looking at 136. I don't think it's going to be that high. I think it's going to be in the low 130s. Now, again, I am not in line with tracking whatsoever. I'm way higher than tracking. Tracking has it about 110, below 120, right? I just feel like tracking's missing a huge swath of the population. I don't know exactly how they track people, but I feel like sometimes it's super off a lot of times. Wonder Woman was way off. Jurassic World was off, but I feel like Jurassic World is off by like $100 million opening weekend. There's an 130 going into the weekend. It does like 212, I think, is what the final number was for Jurassic World. I'm gonna go with 133 as my number for Justice League, and I'm totally bonkers off the wall compared to these other data points. I just feel like it's too big of a franchise and a movie to do much poorer than that. If it does, DC is in real trouble. There may be another Justice League film, but probably not for a while. They'll just focus on the successful ones, like maybe another Superman, keep Wonder Woman going, get Aquaman going, get a Flash, Ezra Miller and Flash movie. Like, I think that would do basically pretty successful. Just keep the budget under $100 million and you'd be good to go. They'll probably focus on those one-off films. But okay, let's say, and like, I'm not going to talk about the other openers this weekend because I've already gone on for a long time and I don't really want to talk about those movies. Let's sort of put in context, you know, what it would mean if Justice League broke out a bit and did 140, 150. I think essentially that would be very successful based on the production history. I think they would find a way to break even in that range. As long as a multiplier was above 2.5x, I think Warner Brothers would find a way to make it work financially for them. Below the 130, 120 range. I think you're going to sort of run into sort of like a push territory. Probably won't make much of a profit at anything below that 120 range, which is where tracking is now. You will have a shuffle at DC and Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers, the executive team, might step in and say, hey, you guys failed us. Like, you got to go. Zack Snyder's got to go. The executive producers have got to go. Like, this whole, just give it over to Patty Jenkins. She knows how to do Wonder Woman. That was successful for us. Give her the reins on this because she knows what she's doing. Or, poach somebody from Marvel and say, hey, like, we don't know what we're doing. We need some real help from an all-star team. We'll take somebody from there. That's always a possibility. But I think that is the case. If it goes below 120, it's going to lose, I think, some decent amount of money. And there will be just a real big shuffle at DC and Warner Brothers. I just don't see how they can continue doing what they're doing when they're going to be losing money. I think the production budget on this was just way too high. And of course there are complications, but it doesn't matter. Those complications don't care. It's got to make real money. And if it can't get over that 120 mark into the 130s, 140s, you're going to have real problems. So I think there's a lot riding on this film. There's a ton riding on this film. And just sort of keeping in line with like the box office sort of culture online, the nerds and what they're talking about. There's a lot of nerves about this film. Like, I think people, when the last tracking came in about, I think it was yesterday, people already have meltdowns because it was like, it's clear it's not going to do like 160. And that's what people, I think, were assuming, especially fans of the series. And it's sort of like, it's coming to realization. And once these reviews started dropping, that like, oh, wow, like this is not going to do that well. But we'll see, we'll see how it does. Like, we don't know until people go out and see it. It could play really well with younger kids and stuff and families. We don't know. So I'll keep an eye on it. I'll probably post, follow me on Twitter, because I'll post a lot about it on Twitter. I'll post tonight when that Rotten Tomato score comes in and see where it's at. And then I will also do a review show of the weekend, and I'll talk about The Star, which is also opening, and Wonder as well this weekend on that show. And we'll do a little postmortem on Justice League and see how it did and see what that means for the series and DCEU. In any event, thanks for listening, guys. This has been the Wildline Podcast. I will be back on Sunday.